The security camera footage was crystal clear. 3 kids splashing in someone else's pool while their mother lounged in a stolen chair, sipping what looked like expensive wine. What Sandra Mitchell didn't know was that the quiet homeowner she'd been terrorizing for months had finally reached his breaking point. As the police sirens wailed in the distance and her smug smile began to falter, Sandra was about to learn that some people don't just roll over and take it. The twist? This wasn't just about a pool. It was about a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. The first thing Marcus Chen noticed when he pulled into his driveway after another soul-crushing day of job interviews was the sound of laughter coming from his backyard. Not the kind of laughter that warmed your heart, the kind that made your blood pressure spike because you knew it didn't belong there. He sat in his Honda Civic for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and closed his eyes. Please let this be a mistake. 6 months of unemployment had worn him down to the bone, and the last thing he needed was another confrontation with Sandra Mitchell, the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. But the sounds didn't stop. If anything, they got louder. Children shrieking with delight, the splash of water, and underneath it all, Sandra's distinctive cackle. The same one she'd used when she'd reported him for having his garbage cans out 12 minutes too early. Last month, Marcus grabbed his briefcase and walked around to the side gate, his Italian leather dress shoes, a relic from his corporate days, crunching on the gravel. What he saw through the slats made his jaw clench so hard his molars ached. 3 kids, ranging from maybe 6 to 10 years old, were doing cannonballs into his pool. His pristine saltwater pool that he'd scraped together every penny to install. 2 years ago, when life was different, when Rebecca was still alive, when he still believed in things like home equity and retirement plans. And there, stretched out on his wife's favorite lounge chair like she owned the place, was Sandra Mitchell, herself. 40-something bleach-blonde hair piled high, wearing a leopard print bikini that did her no favors. She had a wine glass in one hand and her phone in the other, taking what appeared to be Instagram selfies. "You have got to be kidding me," Marcus muttered, fumbling for the gate latch with shaking hands. The gate creaked as he opened it, but the sound was lost in the chaos of the unauthorized pool party. He stood there for a full 30 seconds, watching Sandra direct one of the kids to splash closer to her for a better photo op before his voice found him. "Excuse me?" Nothing. Sandra was too busy posing. "Excuse me." This time, everyone froze. The kids stopped mid-splash, suddenly aware they'd been caught. Sandra looked over her sunglasses with the kind of lazy entitlement that Marcus had come to despise about his HOA president. "Oh, hey, Marcus," she called out cheerfully, not bothering to sit up. "Hope you don't mind. The community pool's being cleaned today, and the kids were just dying for a swim. You know how it is with summer break." Marcus felt something snap inside. His chest, like a rubber band, stretched too far. "Actually, I do mind. I mind very much. This is private property." Sandra laughed, that same grating sound that haunted his dreams. "Oh, don't be such a stick in the mud. It's just for an hour or two. Besides, after all the HOA violations you've racked up lately, I figured you owed the community a little something." The kids had started to climb out of the pool, sensing the tension, but Sandra waved them back in. No, stay put, babies. Uncle Marcus is just having a bad day." "Don't call me uncle," Marcus said quietly. Too quietly. It was the voice Rebecca used to warn him about, the one that came right before he lost his temper completely. "And get out of my pool. Now." Or what? Sandra sat up now, her fake nails drumming against the wine glass. "You'll report me to the HOA?" "News flash, honey. I am the HOA. And according to the community bylaws, any property that's been in violation more than 3 times in a 6-month period can be subject to community use provisions during emergency situations." Marcus stared at her. "That's not real. You just made that up." "Did I?" Sandra's smile was venomous. Maybe you should read the fine print next time before you leave your trash cans out early, or let your grass grow a quarter-inch too long, or, my personal favorite, park your sad little Honda 2 inches over the property line. The kids were watching this exchange like a tennis match, their eyes wide. Marcus noticed one of them, a girl with pigtails who couldn't have been more than 7, was shivering despite the warm afternoon air. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "I don't care what twisted interpretation you have of the HOA rules. This is my house, my pool, and you're trespassing. I'm asking you nicely to leave." "And I'm telling you nicely to kiss my ass," Sandra shot back, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. "What are you going to do about it? Call the cops? On a community? Leader and 3 innocent children? Good luck with that, unemployed boy." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Unemployed boy. As if losing his job at the pharmaceutical company after 15 years wasn't devastating enough. As if having to cash in Rebecca's life insurance policy to keep the house wasn't humiliating enough. As if being 42 years old and starting over from nothing wasn't soul-crushing enough. But it was the way she said it with such casual cruelty that finally pushed him over the edge. "Actually," Marcus said, pulling out his phone, "that's exactly what I'm going to do." Sandra's laugh faltered for just a moment. "You're bluffing." Marcus was already dialing 911. The kids had gone completely silent now, clustering together in the shallow end like frightened minnows. "Wine, what's your emergency?" "Yes, I'd like to report a trespassing in progress. I have an adult and 3 minors on my property who refuse to leave. The address is 1247 Maple Ridge Drive in Willowbrook Estates." Sandra's face was changing color now, the fake tan not quite covering the sudden pallor. "Hang up that phone right now, Marcus. I'm warning you." "Are the trespassers known to you?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes. One of them is Sandra Mitchell, the president of our homeowners association. She's currently in my backyard pool with 3 children, and when I asked her to leave, she refused and became verbally aggressive." "Marcus!" Sandra was on her feet now, wine glass forgotten on the concrete. "You stupid son of a bitch, do you have any idea what you've just done?" "Are you in immediate danger?" the dispatcher continued. Marcus looked at Sandra's furious face, at the 3 kids who were now crying, at his beautiful pool that had become a battlefield, and felt something, cold and determined, settle in his chest. "I don't think so, but the situation is escalating. The adult subject is becoming increasingly hostile and using profanity in front of the children. Units are en route. Please stay on the line and maintain a safe distance." Sandra was frantically gathering up her things now, shouting orders at the kids to get out of the pool. "Kids, now! We're leaving right now!" But it was too late. Marcus could already hear the sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. Sandra heard them too, and the look she gave him could have melted steel. "You have no idea what you've just started," she hissed, clutching her designer pool bag to her chest. "You think this is bad? You think your life sucks now? Just wait. I'm going to make you so miserable you'll wish you'd never moved to this neighborhood." The sirens were getting closer. Much closer. Marcus smiled for the first time in months, and it felt like cracking ice. "You know what, Sandra? I already wished that. Every single day since Rebecca died, I wished I'd never bought this house. But now I'm thinking maybe I'll stick around after all." The first police cruiser rounded the corner, just as Sandra's oldest kid, a boy who looked about 10, started sobbing openly. The cruiser's lights weren't on, but there was something official and final about its presence that made the whole scene suddenly feel very, very real. Sandra Mitchell, HOA president and neighborhood terror, was about to discover that sometimes the quiet ones bite back hardest when cornered, and Marcus Chen was about to learn that making that call would change everything, not just for Sandra, but for the entire community that had watched her reign of suburban tyranny go unchallenged for far too long. The second police car was already pulling up behind the first. Officer Maria Santos had been a cop for 12 years, and she'd learned to read situations the moment she stepped out of her patrol car. What she saw at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive was a textbook case of suburban entitlement gone wrong. 3 soaking, wet kids huddled together on expensive patio furniture, shivering despite the heat. A middle-aged Asian man in a wrinkled business suit standing perfectly still with his phone in his hand, looking like he'd just made the hardest decision of his life, and a blonde woman in a leopard print bikini frantically shoving pool toys into a designer bag while shooting daggers at everyone within a 50-foot radius. "Afternoon, folks," Santos said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made even innocent people straighten up. "I'm Officer Santos. This is Officer Rodriguez. We got a call about a trespassing situation." The woman in the bikini immediately launched into damage control mode. "Officer, thank God you're here. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I'm Sandra Mitchell, president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, and this is just a community dispute that got blown out of proportion." Santos had dealt with HOA presidents before. In her experience, they fell into 2 categories: well-meaning busybodies or power-drunk tyrants. Something about Sandra's overly bright smile and the way she kept positioning herself between the officers and the homeowner told Santos everything she needed to know about which category this one fell into. "And you are?" Rodriguez asked, turning to Marcus. "Marcus Chen. I own this house. I came home from work and found them in my pool without permission. When I asked them to leave, she refused." "Work?" Sandra's voice dripped with false sweetness. "That's interesting, considering the whole neighborhood knows you've been unemployed for months. But I guess job interviews count as work now." Santos watched Marcus's jaw tighten. She'd seen that look before. The expression of a man who'd been pushed right up to his breaking point and was fighting not to go over the edge. "Ma'am," Santos said to Sandra, "can you confirm that you don't live at this address?" "Well, no, but—" "And did Mr. Chen ask you to leave his property?" Sandra's smile flickered. "Look, officer, this is really just a neighborhood dispute. The HOA has certain provisions for community use of amenities during emergency situations. I need a yes or no answer. Did Mr. Chen ask you to leave his property?" The silence stretched out long enough that even the kids stopped sniffling to listen. "Yes," Sandra finally admitted, "but the context is important here. This man has been flagrantly violating HOA regulations for months, and as community president, I have certain rights." "No," Rodriguez interrupted, consulting his notepad. "You have the right to remain silent if we decide to arrest you for criminal trespassing. Would you like to exercise that right now?" The word arrest hit Sandra like a physical blow. Her face went through several color changes before settling on an unattractive shade of purple. "You can't be serious. I'm a pillar of this community. I volunteer at the school. I organize the 4th of July block party." Santos had heard it all before. "Ma'am, I need you to gather your belongings and your children and remove yourselves from this property immediately." "They're not my children," Sandra snapped, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, they're my sister's kids. I'm babysitting. This is exactly the kind of power-tripping nonsense that makes people hate cops." "Aunt Sandy," the smallest girl whispered, tugging on Sandra's cover-up, "I want to go home. I'm cold." For the first time since the officers arrived, Marcus spoke up. "There are towels in the pool house," he said quietly. "The kids shouldn't have to sit there wet while we sort this out." Santos noticed the gesture and filed it away. In domestic disputes, she'd learned to pay attention to who showed compassion under stress and who doubled down on their position. "That won't be necessary," Sandra said quickly. "We're leaving right now." She started herding the kids toward the gate, but Santos stepped into her path. "Actually, ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification first, and I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment." Sandra's face went pale beneath her makeup. "Is that really necessary? I think we've all had enough drama for one day. I'm afraid it is." Santos turned to Rodriguez. Can you take statements from Mr. Chen and the children? Marcus watched as Officer Santos walked Sandra over to the far end of his patio, their voices too low to hear, but their body language telling the whole story. Sandra's gestures grew more animated while Santos remained perfectly still, occasionally nodding or writing something down. Mr. Chen? Rodriguez had his pen ready. Can you walk me through what happened when you got home today? Marcus found himself telling the whole story. Not just today's incident, but months of escalating harassment. The citations for infractions that seemed to multiply overnight, the passive-aggressive notes left on his door. The way Sandra had made his grief over Rebecca's death into a neighborhood spectacle by constantly reporting him for things like leaving his porch light on too late or having excessive mourning decorations in his front yard. She's been systematically targeting me since my wife died, Marcus said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. At first I thought it was just bad timing, but the violations started getting more frequent and more petty. Last week she cited me for having a car in my driveway for more than 72 hours, my own car parked in my own driveway. Rodriguez was writing it all down. Do you have documentation of these citations? Every single one. I've been keeping records because I thought maybe I'd contest them at the next HOA meeting, but honestly, I just didn't have the energy to fight anymore. And today was different. Marcus looked over at Sandra, who was now jabbing her finger at Officer Santos, while the 3 kids sat shivering on his patio furniture. Today she crossed a line. This pool, my wife and I saved for 2 years to put it in. She picked out every tile, every fixture. It was going to be our project for retirement. His voice caught slightly. Sandra knew that. She knew exactly what she was doing when she decided to have her pool party here. Rodriguez looked up from his notepad. Your wife passed away recently. 10 months ago. Cancer. Marcus cleared his throat. Sandra sent me a formal HOA violation notice 3 days after the funeral because the hearse had blocked part of the sidewalk during the service. Even Rodriguez, who'd seen plenty of human cruelty in his line of work, looked shocked. She cited you for your wife's funeral? Improper street parking during non-permitted gatherings, Marcus recited from memory. $50 fine. Over by the pool house, Sandra's voice was getting louder despite Officer Santos's obvious attempts to keep the conversation quiet. This is harassment, Sandra was saying. Pure and simple. This man has been looking for any excuse to cause trouble, and now he's using you people to intimidate me. Santos's response was too quiet to hear, but whatever she said made Sandra take a step back. Rodriguez finished taking Marcus's statement just as the 2 women returned. Sandra looked like she'd been through a wood chipper, her perfectly styled hair now a mess and her makeup smeared from what might have been tears of rage. Mr. Chen, Officer Santos said, based on what I've heard today, you have grounds to file formal charges for criminal trespassing if you choose to do so. Sandra made a sound like she'd been punched. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You were asked to leave private property and refused. That's textbook trespassing. The fact that you're the HOA president doesn't give you any special rights to someone else's backyard. Marcus felt a strange sense of lightness, like a weight he'd been carrying for months was finally being lifted. What would that involve? You'd need to come down to the station to file a formal complaint. There would probably be a court date. Given that this is a first offense and there are children involved, she'd likely get community service and a fine, but it would go on her record. Sandra's carefully constructed facade finally cracked completely. You bastard, she hissed at Marcus. You think this changes anything? You think having me arrested is going to solve your problems? I'll make your life hell. I'll have you thrown out of this neighborhood so fast. Ma'am, Santos interrupted sharply. I strongly advise you to stop talking right now. But Sandra was beyond caring about advice. 10 months of grief and harassment and humiliation boiled, over all at once. You want to know what your precious homeowner is really like, officer? He's a drunk. He sits in that house every night drinking himself to death, and when he passes out, he leaves his music on so loud the whole block can hear it. That's not true, Marcus said quietly. Isn't it? What about last Tuesday when Mrs. Patterson called? Me at midnight because your stereo was blasting sad songs loud enough to wake the dead? Marcus felt his cheeks burn. He had been drinking last Tuesday. It was Rebecca's birthday, and he'd put on their wedding playlist, and maybe he had turned it up too loud, but even if that were true, Santos said, it doesn't give you the right to trespass on his property, and it doesn't give you the right to threaten him, Rodriguez added. What you just said about making his life hell could be construed as harassment or intimidation. The fight went out of Sandra all at once, like air from a punctured balloon. She looked around at the 3 crying children, the 2 stern-faced police officers, and Marcus, with his phone still in his hand, like a weapon he'd just learned how to use. Carol Patterson had been a kindergarten teacher for 43 years before retiring, which meant she knew exactly how to command a room full of unruly people who weren't listening. "Sit down and be quiet," she bellowed in a voice that could stop a charging rhinoceros. The community center fell silent so quickly that the sudden absence of noise was almost deafening. Sandra's face went white. In 30 years of HOA politics, no one had ever challenged her authority so directly, especially not in front of the entire community. "Carol, please, I know you're upset, but—" I said, "Be quiet." Carol's voice could have cut glass. "I've sat here for 20 minutes listening to you tell lies about a good man, and I'm done. We're all done." She turned to face the room, her silver hair catching the fluorescent lights like a crown. "How many of you actually witnessed what happened yesterday? Raise your hands." A few hands went up reluctantly, people who lived close, enough to have seen the police cars or heard the commotion. "And how many of you are basing your opinions on what Sandra told you over the phone today?" The silence was answer enough. Carol nodded grimly. "I thought so. Well, let me tell you what really happened, because I watched the whole thing from my kitchen window." She pointed directly at Sandra. "This woman decided to throw herself a pool party in Marcus Chen's backyard without his permission. When he came home and found trespassers on his property, he asked them to leave. When they refused, he called the police. That's it. That's the entire story. But the threats—" Someone called out from the middle of the room. "What threats?" Carol's voice dripped with contempt. "Marcus never threatened anyone." The only person making threats was Sandra, who told him she was going to make his life miserable for daring to report her criminal behavior to the authorities. Sandra found her voice. "Carol, you're clearly confused. Perhaps at your age, don't you dare." Carol's words came out like bullets. "I may be 74 years old, but my hearing is perfect, and my memory is excellent. And I remember every single one of the lies you've told about Marcus Chen over the past 10 months. She pulled a small notebook from her purse. "June 15th, you cited him for excessive mourning decorations 3 days after his wife's funeral. July 2nd, you reported him for improper garbage can placement when the cancer treatments had left Rebecca too weak to bring them in on time. August 21st, you fined him for weeds in his garden bed while he was spending 18 hours a day at the hospital watching his wife die." Each date hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus watched his neighbors' faces change as they processed what Carol was saying. September 3rd, Carol continued relentlessly. You sent him a violation notice for having a medical supply delivery truck in his driveway for more than 72 hours. It was delivering oxygen equipment for his dying wife. Sandra's carefully constructed composure was cracking. "Those were legitimate violations. Personal circumstances don't excuse—" "Personal circumstances?" Carol's voice rose to a pitch that made everyone in the room wince. "His wife was dying, Sandra. She was 39 years old and dying of cancer, and instead of showing an ounce of human compassion, you stalked that man like a predator looking for every opportunity to kick him. While he was down, the room was so quiet now that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. He looked around and saw expressions changing, doubt creeping into faces that had been set in judgment just minutes before. And when poor Rebecca finally passed, Carol continued, consulting her notebook. Did Sandra give him time to grieve? Did she show up with a casserole or offer to help with yard work like the rest of us? No, she cited him for the hearse blocking part of the sidewalk during the funeral service. During the funeral service, a woman in the back row gasped audibly. Marcus recognized her as Mrs. Chen from 3 streets over. No relation, despite the shared name. She'd brought him soup after Rebecca's funeral. That's monstrous, Mrs. Chen said quietly. It gets worse, Carol said, turning a page in her notebook. October through March, Sandra issued 37 separate violations against Marcus's property. 37. Want to know how many violations she issued against all other properties in the same time period? 14. Total. The math was impossible to ignore. Even people who weren't good with numbers could see that Marcus had been systematically targeted. Sandra was desperately trying to regain control. Those violations were all legitimate. If Mr. Chen couldn't maintain his property according to community standards, then perhaps what? The voice came from the back of the room. It was Jim Rodriguez, a middle-aged contractor who lived on Elm Street. Perhaps we should kick a man out of his home for having the audacity to grieve his wife. The safety concerns are real, Sandra insisted. The noise complaints, the erratic behavior. What noise complaints? Carol interrupted. You mean the one night? Rebecca's birthday? When he played their wedding music a little too loud? The night I called you because I was worried about him, not because I wanted him in trouble. Sandra's face went ashen. That's not what you said when I said I was concerned about Marcus, and maybe you should check on him as a neighbor, not as the HOA president. But you twisted that into a violation too, didn't you? Marcus felt something loosening in his chest, like a fist that had been clenched around his heart for months was finally opening. These people, his neighbors, were starting to see Sandra for what she really was. And today, Carol continued, building to her crescendo, today she had the unmitigated gall to call employers around town and tell them that Marcus is unstable and dangerous. She's actively trying to sabotage his job search because she's furious that he finally stood up to her. The room erupted. People were talking over each other, voices raised in anger and disbelief. She called employers? That's illegal. How did you even know he was job hunting? Sandra was looking around the room like a cornered animal. I was protecting the community. You don't understand what this man is capable of. What he's capable of? Jim Rodriguez was on his feet now. Lady, the only thing Marcus Chen is capable of is being a decent human being who's been going through hell. I worked construction on his house 3 years ago. I watched him carry Rebecca's breakfast up to her every morning when she was sick. I saw him plant that garden because she wanted to be able to see flowers from the bedroom window. And you've been torturing him like he's some kind of criminal. Other voices joined in. I remember when he shoveled my driveway after my hip surgery. He drove Mrs. Kowalski to her chemo appointments when her son couldn't. He fixed our sprinkler system. For free last summer, Marcus listened to his neighbors defend him and felt tears burning behind his eyes. For months, he'd felt completely alone, like the entire world was against him. Now he realized that Sandra's reign of terror had isolated him from people who actually cared about him. Furthermore, Carol said, raising her voice over the din, I did some research today after Marcus was kind enough to warn me about Sandra's plans. Did you know that in the past 5 years, Sandra has initiated forced sale proceedings against 4 other families in this community? The room went quiet again. The Washingtons on Pine Street, forced out after Sandra decided their teenage son's friends were loitering too often. The elderly couple on Oak Avenue, forced out after Sandra claimed their medical equipment was an eyesore. The young family on Birch Road, forced out after Sandra decided their children's playground equipment violated aesthetic standards. Sandra was shaking her head frantically. Those were all legitimate? They were all people who couldn't afford to fight you in court, Carol snapped. People who sold their homes at a loss rather than face years of legal battles with HOA lawyers. And every single time, Sandra's friends and family members ended up buying those properties at below-market prices. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Marcus saw people turning to look at Sandra with new understanding, seeing the pattern of behavior that had been hiding in plain sight. "That's a serious accusation," said Dave Morrison, the HOA treasurer. "Carol, do you have proof?" Carol smiled for the first time that evening, and it was not a nice smile. "Funny you should ask, Dave, because I spent today at the county recorder's office pulling property records. Your son bought the Washington house 6 months after they were forced to sell. Sandra's brother-in-law bought the Oak Avenue property. And her daughter got the Birch Road house for $30,000 under market value." The room exploded into chaos. People were shouting, demanding explanations, asking questions. Sandra was trying to talk over the noise, but no one was listening to her anymore. Marcus watched it all with a sense of surreal detachment. Just an hour ago, he'd walked into this room expecting to be railroaded out of his home. Now he was watching Sandra's carefully constructed empire crumble in real time. "This meeting is over," Sandra finally shouted, gathering up her papers with shaking hands. "We'll reconvene when people can conduct themselves in a civilized manner." "Like hell it's over," Jim Rodriguez called out. "I move for a vote of no confidence in Sandra Mitchell as HOA president." "Seconded," Carol said immediately. "All in favor?" The forest of hands that shot up was overwhelming. Marcus counted quickly. It looked like at least 3/4 of the room. Sandra stood frozen at the front of the room, her face cycling through express. Marcus barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Sandra's voice. "I still know things about you, about your wife, about what really happened in those final weeks. What could she possibly know?" Rebecca's final weeks had been a blur of hospital visits, experimental treatments, and desperate late-night conversations about things they should have said years earlier. The only people who'd been there were doctors, nurses, and... Marcus sat up in bed as the memory hit him like a freight train. The security cameras. When Rebecca's condition had worsened and she'd needed round-the-clock care, Marcus had installed a security system with cameras covering all the entrances to the house. The hospice nurse had suggested it, not for security, but so Marcus could monitor Rebecca when he had to step away for a few minutes. He'd forgotten all about the cameras after Rebecca died. They were still there, still recording, still uploading footage to a cloud storage account he'd set up and then abandoned in his grief. And Sandra, with her obsessive neighborhood surveillance and her habit of documenting everything, would have noticed them, would have wondered what they captured, would have found a way to... His phone rang, jerking him out of his spiral of panic. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Marcus, it's Carol Patterson. I'm sorry to call so early, but we have a problem." Marcus glanced at his clock. 6:47 a.m. "What kind of problem?" Sandra's been busy. "There's an emergency board meeting called for this afternoon, and she's claiming she has new evidence about your unfitness as a community member. She's also filed complaints with the county health department and Adult Protective Services." "Adult Protective Services? Why would she..." Marcus stopped. APS investigated cases of elder abuse, but they also looked into situations where people might be a danger to themselves or others. "She's trying to have me declared mentally incompetent." That's what it looks like. "Marcus, what could she possibly have on you? Yesterday you had the whole community on your side, and now she's acting like she's holding royal flush, the security cameras. It had to be. But what could they have captured that would be damaging enough for Sandra to feel confident?" "Again?" "I need to check something," Marcus said. "Can you meet me here in an hour?" "Of course. Marcus, whatever she thinks she has, we'll figure out how to fight it." After Carol hung up, Marcus fired up his laptop and logged into the security system, account for the first time since Rebecca's death. The cloud storage was nearly full. months of footage automatically uploaded and organized by date. He scrolled back to Rebecca's final weeks, his hands shaking as he clicked on files he'd never wanted to see again. Most of the footage was exactly what he'd expected. Marcus helping Rebecca to the bathroom, bringing her meals she couldn't eat, sitting beside her bed reading aloud from the books she'd loved. But then he found the file from 3 days before. Rebecca died and his blood turned to ice. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. On the screen, Marcus watched himself stumble into the living room, clearly drunk, shouting at empty air. He watched himself throw a glass across the room, watched it shatter against the wall just feet from where Rebecca lay sleeping in the hospital bed they'd set up by the window. He watched himself grab Rebecca's medications from the bedside table. The morphine that kept her comfortable, the anti-anxiety pills that helped her sleep, the experimental drug that wasn't helping but that they'd kept taking anyway because stopping felt like giving up. And he watched himself pour all of it into his palm, staring at the pills like they held the answer to everything. The memory came, flooding back. He'd been drinking, had been drinking most nights those final weeks because it was the only way to sleep, the only way to stop the thoughts that circled his brain like vultures. He'd been angry that night, furious at God and cancer and the unfairness of watching someone so good suffer so much. He'd grabbed the pills in a moment of desperate, drunken rage, thinking that maybe if Rebecca took them all at once, her suffering would end. Maybe they'd both be free. But then Rebecca had stirred in her bed, opened her eyes and looked at him with such infinite understanding and forgiveness that he'd collapsed beside her, sobbing as she talked him through the worst moment of his life. "I know you want to help me," she'd whispered, taking the pills from his hand and setting them carefully back on the nightstand. "But this isn't the way. I need you to fight with me, not for me. Can you do that?" He'd promised her he would. Had poured the remaining whiskey down the sink and stayed sober for every one of her remaining days. Had been holding her hand when she died peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by love instead of the desperate darkness he'd almost chosen. It was the worst thing he'd ever contemplated, and the moment that had ultimately saved them both. And now Sandra had it on video. Marcus slammed the laptop shut and ran to the bathroom just in time to throw up everything in his stomach. When Carol arrived an hour later, she found him sitting on his kitchen floor, staring at nothing. "Marcus? Dear God, what happened?" He told her everything. About the cameras, about that night, about the pills and the whiskey, and the moment when he'd almost done something unforgivable. Carol listened without judgment, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand. "She's going to say I tried to kill Rebecca," Marcus finished. "She's going to show that video to Adult Protective Services and tell them I'm dangerous. They'll have me committed or arrested or—" "Stop!" Carol's voice was firm but gentle. "Let me see the video." Marcus shook his head. "You don't understand. It looks exactly like what she'll say it looks like. A drunk man contemplating murdering his wife. Marcus, look at me." Carol waited until he met her eyes. "I was married to Harold for 52 years. I know what love looks like. And I know what desperation looks like. Show me the video." With shaking hands, Marcus opened the laptop and played the file. Carol watched in silence, her face showing no judgment, only sadness. "You didn't give her those pills," she said when it was over. "But I thought about it. For a moment, I actually thought about it. And then you didn't. You chose love over fear, hope over despair. You chose to honor what Rebecca wanted instead of what you wanted." Carol closed the laptop gently. "That's not the actions of a murderer, Marcus. That's the actions of a man who loved his wife so much he almost made a terrible mistake, and then loved her enough to choose the right path. Sandra won't see it that way. No one will." Carol was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was the same dangerous smile she'd worn the night before. "You know what your problem is, Marcus? You keep underestimating your neighbors. Yes, that video looks bad without context, But Sandra's going to have to show it to people who knew you and Rebecca. People who watched you care for her with a devotion that was beautiful to witness. She stood up and straightened her floral dress like she was preparing for battle. Besides, she said, her voice taking on a tone that would have terrified her kindergarten students, Sandra's made one crucial mistake. She's forgotten that I've been keeping records too, and my records go back a lot further than hers. What do you mean? Carol's smile turned predatory. I mean that Sandra Mitchell has been very careless over the years about what she says and does when she thinks no one important is watching. And it turns out that sometimes the little old lady next door is more important than she realized. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Carol was heading for the door. The emergency meeting is at 3 o'clock, she called back. Don't you dare miss it. And Marcus, bring that laptop. We're going to need it. As Carol disappeared down his front walk, Marcus realized that he'd made the same mistake as Sandra. He'd underestimated his neighbor. The question was whether Carol Patterson's arsenal would be enough to survive what Sandra was about to unleash, or whether the worst moment of Marcus's life was about to become a public spectacle that would destroy everything he had left. One way or another, the truth was about to come out. All of it.